Tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everyone. Bulavanaka, talofa lava, kia ora ana, hello keta, and a warm welcome to this Business Link Pacific webinar. I'd particularly like to welcome the VLAB coaches who have just joined us from Vanuatu today. Hey, thanks guys for logging into this webinar. Now, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Barbara Wilkinson, and I am Business Link Pacific's Professional Development Advisor. So one of my roles at BLP is to support business advisors with the skills they need to provide high quality advisory services. So it's my great pleasure to host this second webinar series, which is focused all on business advisory skills. So in this particular series, we focus on the competencies business advisors need, and we're going to share experiences on what it takes to be a business advisor. Last month, we looked at interpreting financial reports, which we now have a recording of for those of you who attended that, so you can access that on the BLP website. We've also looked at the legal knowledge that businesses need, or that advisors should have. And in today's session, I'm joined by my colleague, Jen Bartlett, and we're going to discuss business coaching and training. And we're particularly keen to talk to this topic because BLP is getting quite a number of subsidy requests for business coaching and training services. And so we want to ensure that advisors know how they can successfully access these subsidies and explore coaching and training skills with us in this session. So before we start this webinar though, I've got a very small request of all of our participants today. Please, can you pop a note in the chat box that's on the right-hand side of your screen with any ideas or requests that you might have for topics that you'd like us to cover in this webinar series. We really welcome your input on any professional development ideas, but particularly on the skills that business advisors need. You can also email me directly as well. But we really want to make sure that we're covering the topics that are useful to you. And the only way we can do that is by getting your feedback. So please, do let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. Now, before we start today's topic, I'd just like to briefly outline the format for the session and provide a very short update on BLP's activities. So firstly, I'd like to ask you to please keep your microphones and cameras on mute, as this helps to ensure a good connection. Please feel free, though, to ask questions throughout the webinar by using the chat box, and we will be asking for your thoughts and feedback. If we run out of time for questions today, we'll make a note of any unanswered questions and we'll email you afterwards. And we are recording the webinar today, so you can also access it afterwards too. That's if you need to recap on anything. It'll be saved on the BLP website. We did have a little problem last month, but that's all fixed now. So all of our webinars are available to review on the BLP website. Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar with BLP yet, I just want to do a quick rundown of what Business Link Pacific is all about and some of our recent achievements. Well, firstly, BLP is funded by the New Zealand government. It's a private sector development initiative and it's delivered by DT Global. So we work in 6 countries, that's Cook Islands, Fiji, PNG, Samoa, Solomon Islands and Vanuatu. And shortly we'll be adding Tonga and Kiribati to the network. We work in partnership with chambers of commerce, with financial institutions and of course the private sector to develop our network of business advisory service providers in the Pacific region. And we enable SMEs or small businesses to access advisors' services in our network through our searchable database. So the idea being that SMEs can be confident that all BLP approved advisors are high quality advisors because they've been through the BLP quality assurance process. So all BLP approved advisors go through our competency assessment process to ensure that they have the skills and experience to provide high quality advice. So we know that being able to access expert advisors really makes a difference to SMEs. It helps them to grow and develop, and so much more than if they're working unsupported without that professional advice. So our subsidy scheme also helps SMEs to access the advice by providing subsidised rates to those services. Now, also we have some free online tools such as the Business Health Check, also the Business Continuity Planner, and they help businesses to identify any gaps that they might need to work on, or perhaps think about some risks and contingencies that they should plan for. And of course, we also offer professional development and support to our network of advisors. So obviously the webinar series, but also through our business advisor development program, our podcast series, and we offer individual support services to advisory firms. So very soon as well, quite exciting, BLP will also be launching the new finance facility as well. So do watch this space. So very briefly, just a little bit about our achievements. Since starting in 2018, BLP has subsidised over 500 businesses to access advisory services, and that support has helped those businesses to grow. They've also found our online tools really helpful, and our advisor network now consists of over 100 advisory firms with over 150 individually approved advisors, and they've all got various areas of technical expertise and which support business growth. So that's a little bit about BLP. So now I'd like to welcome Jen Bartlett to the session. Jen, you've been working, well, we both have been working with BLP since it first started back in 2018. Can you share with us what your role is with BLP?
Yeah, sure, Barbara, and hi everyone. It's nice to join you this afternoon. Yes, so in the last almost 3 years with Business Link Pacific, I work on a part-time basis helping with developing tools. I also now am the assessor for the competency assessment tool for business and planning and strategy, marketing and advertising and promotion. And I also provide a support role to the business services managers that we have in each of the countries.
And you also consult on a range of other projects as well, don't you? What other things have you been doing recently?
So this year, most of the work is in not only but in tourism. So I've worked on a World Bank IFC project in Fiji. I've advised to the Strong and Business program in Solomon Islands, and working on two projects with Sustainable Travel International, one in Palau, and another is their global, as a tutor on their global course. But it's not all tourism. I also worked with the Ministry of Commerce in Samoa on their MSME policy earlier this year, which I understand is just being passed. So yes, it's not, I don't profess to be an expert at all by any means in coaching and training, but several years ago I got quite involved through working with the Branson Centre of Entrepreneurship and World Vision on their micro and small enterprise programs, which involved a lot of designing and managing training and coaching programs.
It sounds like you have quite a bit of experience in business coaching and training though. But tell me, have you ever been on the receiving end of business coaching? And if so, how was that for you?
Coaching, no. I mean, I've delivered coaching, but unfortunately I haven't. And now that I've, over the last several years, realised the importance of it, I really wish that I had. I've sought out mentors in my career and sort of professional career advisors, people I admired who I would go to for professional development advice, but coaching, I wish I had, because there's a lot of business skills that I probably could have improved earlier in my career.
You know, it's interesting that you say that you've sought out mentors for yourself. So it sounds like you've had to be sort of quite self-directed in terms of your own professional development.
Yeah,
I suppose. Yeah, I suppose that's been quite similar for me in my career too. It would have been nice to have had someone to offer business coaching for me too. But I suppose if you can gain the awareness of the areas that you need to strengthen yourself, then you can design your own learning journey and be self-directed. So yeah, no, that's cool. Okay, so in today's webinar, we're going to talk about some models and principles, and we're going to share a few thoughts and experiences. So we thought we'd cover these aspects. So firstly, we thought we'd look at the purpose of and some definitions for training and coaching. Then look more specifically at the BLP competencies. So these 4 competencies these 4 areas are linked directly to the questions that we ask in our competency assessment tool. So if you're looking to become an approved advisor for coaching and training, then I'm sure you'll find this webinar really helpful, because we're focusing right on those questions. And then thirdly, we're going to look at BLP's requirements for accessing a subsidy for coaching and training services. And that section will be really helpful too, in terms of both applying for a BLP subsidy, but also, you know, in general, establishing a coaching or training program. That's really helpful. So firstly, then let me start with a look at why we do coaching. So, you know, why do we train? Why do we coach? I think that's a pretty simple question, isn't it? And I'm sure we all know why we do coaching and training. It's to learn new skills and knowledge, right? But you'd be surprised the number of companies that get this fundamental thinking wrong. So usually businesses implement training and coaching because there's a skill or a knowledge gap, and that gap is preventing someone from performing or from behaving in ways that we want them to behave. So really what we're saying is the real purpose of coaching and training is, yes, to learn new skills and knowledge, but it's so that we can change behaviors, right? And often it's managers or supervisors that want to improve their employees' skills. They want to change their behaviours. But it can also be ourselves, like Jen and I, recognising that there's a shortcoming in our own performance that we personally want to rectify. Often, though, we don't know what we don't know, and so it can be really difficult to identify what our own shortcomings are unless someone helps us to identify them. Now, I've known several companies that have launched into big training programs without really knowing what they're trying to achieve. I've also known companies that have delivered fabulous training programs, but they've delivered them to the wrong people, you know, to people who perhaps already have the skills. And then there's others that have got the right people on board, but the content is irrelevant to them, or it's pitched at the wrong level, so it's gone completely over the employees' heads. So it's really important to firstly think about what your reasons are for coaching and training. You know, that's the first point that I would make, really. So there's also refresher training. So, you know, that might not be about changing behaviours. And that's true, you know, that's probably more about reinforcing behaviours and reminding and updating skills. Refresher training, it also helps us to gain a deeper insight and go into topic more deeply as well. Yeah. Okay, so thinking about changing behaviours, I just want to share this model, which I find quite useful. And it's B.J. Fogg's model. He's an American social scientist who came up with the model. He says that behaviour change happens when motivation, ability, and a prompt all come together at the same time. So firstly, if we look at the motivation axis, he said underpinning motivation are 3 drivers that motivate us. So we might be motivated by sensation, or through anticipation, or by belonging. Okay, so yeah, those are the 3 sort of underpinning drivers of motivation. Now, I think we've just lost Jen for a moment. I'm just trying to get her back. Jen, are you with us yet? I can't seem to find Sandra. I might get you to just help out, see if we can access Jen back again. I think we've lost our key co-facilitator. Okay, so let me carry on. So let's look at that motivation axis. So those 3 drivers, you know, sensation, anticipation, and or belonging. What they mean by that is, so sensation relates firstly to like pleasure. So as in, we're motivated towards doing pleasurable things, right? So we get a good sensation from something that's pleasurable. Or conversely, we're motivated to avoid pain. Secondly, there's an anticipation element to motivation, which relates to hope, or conversely, it might be a fear element. But overall, it's that looking forward to kind of element. And then thirdly, there's a third motivation element, which is about a sense of belonging. So we want to belong to a group or a community, or conversely, we're motivated to not feel rejected. And so, you know, why am I talking about this? Well, in a coaching and training setting, we need to think about these factors to get people motivated in learning. So how we incorporate them in the group, you know, getting them to feel that sense of belonging, we need to incorporate that. We need to think about some fun elements, the pleasure side, and then we need to try and link it to some future goals. Okay, so secondly, that ability access. So this part of the model is not about a person's ability, but instead he means it as how easy it is for someone to do something. So the easier it is to do, the less motivation is needed to get action. So as you'll see, there's a direct relationship between motivation and ability, the two axes on the graph. So, you know, the easier it is to do, the less motivation is required, and so it's easier to get action at that point. Ability might relate to the physical effort required to do something, or having the money to do it, or even how easy it is to fit into your usual routine. Now then, thirdly, he says that there needs to be a prompt as well, or a trigger to change the behaviours, and it could be something like a reminder or a signal. And in a business setting, it could be the implementation of new technology that prompts the need for employees to change the way that they work. So it's the impetus to get the behaviour change in motion. Now, I quite like this model because it gets you to think beyond the content of your training or coaching program, and more into the psychology of behaviour change, which I think is really important in terms of adult learning. Right, so also this model is really relevant to other business areas like marketing, or attracting new customers, or setting up new systems and processes. So what I think this slide is really saying is you need to think both about the why, you know, why you're training, and the how you'll run your training or coaching program, as well as the what, you know, the content that you're going to cover. And often I think we have a sense that training's needed, but perhaps we don't always deliberately think about why and how we do it. Now, I just want to see, have we got Jen back, or have we lost her forever? That's going to be a bit of a problem if I've not got her with me, because she's going to be presenting half of this stuff. Sandra, are you able to assist me with trying to get Jen into the room? I don't seem to be able to see her. Okay. All right. I'm just going to make a quick call out to Jen, because she's got a slide that I'd really like her to present. Jen, are you there? She's having problems with her internet. I'm going to continue on. Okay, looks like there's we've got an internet problem today. We've got somebody else with a connection issue as well. Can everybody else just pop a little note into the chat room and let me know how your connection is? Okay, all right. Look, I'm going to carry on and talk about this next issue, this next item, which is how we might define, or how we might look at the terminology that we use around business training and coaching. So one way is to look at it from a push-pull perspective, and Jen explains this really well. One way is, you know, how we support people is looking at that. You know, it's like a problem that we have to solve. So sometimes you need to push people towards the solution, and other times they need to pull the solution towards themselves. So this is a really useful model that really thinks about you know, they're like that non-directive approach, pulling solutions to them. So let's think about this from firstly a training point of view. So very much training is about telling, it's about instructing, it's about giving advice, whereas perhaps coaching is more at the other end of the continuum, at the pull end of the continuum. It's about listening, it's about reflecting, and it's about paraphrasing and asking those questions. So it's a completely different perspective. So then if you think about some other terms like advising, you know, where might that sit? So, you know, that's perhaps more about, you know, offering guidance, giving advice. It's, again, reasonably directive. And mentoring, suggestive, perhaps. And I quite like this model because I think, you know, in here, it gets you to see things in it from a different perspective. And there's no right or wrong about this. You know, when you think about your role as a business advisor, you're being quite directive. Mentoring is quite suggestive, but, you know, being that coaching, it's really about being led by the coachee. And that's quite a different thing to think about. So I've got a coaching client that's like that. And I noticed that the nature of our relationship is shifting up the continuum as we work together, as we continue our work. So when I first started working with her, I found that I would be the one that suggests the content that we cover, with her agreement, of course. And now I'm just there for when she wants to call on me. So we still might meet quite regularly, but it's very much led by her. So, for example, she might ask me to review some documents and the reports that she's written, but every now and then there's a tricky staff issue that she wants a second opinion on. But I've noticed that increasingly, as time goes by, I have to change my approach. You know, where I used to suggest, hey, you do this, that, and the other. Now I'm having to ask, so what do you think you're going to do about that? So our relationship's kind of morphing from a being led by me to a being led by her situation. And it's really quite interesting from my perspective because I've got to recognize the signals and adjust my approach. So, you know, as a coach, that's quite challenging. I've got to really observe what's going on for her and try and meet her new needs as they change and evolve over time. Perhaps people might like to just pop some thoughts into this model, into the chat box right now, and help me out a little bit, seeing as I've lost Jen along the way. Anybody want to comment on any of those things that we've spoken about there? Okay, good to hear that you've got a good connection in the Cook Islands. That's fantastic. Excellent. Any other comments from someone else? I'd appreciate your feedback on this. We seem to be losing a few. Okay, I think it's also interesting to note, you know, from a donor's point of view as well, that often, you know, different organisations use different terms. So I know, for example, the New Zealand Business Mentors Scheme, you know, when that was around, they perhaps used it in more of a coaching perspective rather than, you know, further up that pull continuum than down below. So yeah, so that was interesting. Okay, so let's have a look at the BLP competencies on coaching and training. So these are the technical competencies, as I say, that BLP uses in our competency assessment tool. So you'll find that there's 4 questions in there, and you're asked to talk about, you know, the first one is, you know, when you've carried out a needs analysis, talk about a time when you've applied the principles of adult learning, talk about a time when you've set goals or planned a training program or a coaching program, and then fourthly, you know, tell us about how you've supported and engaged learners. So let's have a closer look at those competencies. Okay, so I know that, you know, there's different ways that you can do needs analysis firstly. So here's a few different techniques that you can use around needs analysis. So I think from a coaching perspective, it might be about talking to people, obviously, you know, interviewing them, asking them what they think their needs are, face-to-face interviews, but maybe a semi-structured kind of questionnaire that gives a little bit more insight and requires a little bit more thought into what their needs are. Whereas, you know, maybe training, you need to do something a bit more formal. I remember when I used to manage workplace literacy and numeracy training programs here in New Zealand, And we often worked in the manufacturing sector, actually, where there's quite a high proportion of people who speak English as a second language. So our clients, the companies, they would come to us because they recognised that some of their employees needed to improve their performance in terms of following procedures and completing documentation correctly. So often they found that the same errors were being made all the time, and they couldn't really understand why until we went in and did a training needs analysis. So our approach was twofold. Firstly, we looked at the business need. Okay, so we would get to know the manufacturing process, we'd look at standard operating procedures, we'd get a thorough understanding of what was expected of the employees, and then we'd observe them in action. Interestingly, we often found that the standard operating procedures themselves were not written that well, or they didn't flow that well. So it wasn't always the employee's performance that was the problem. Sometimes it was actually about changing the system. But then the second step for us was to then look at the individual employee's skill needs. And we actually did quite a formal reading and writing assessment with them. And it was, of course, contextualised to their work tasks. And typically we found that they needed help with their English or with their literacy and numeracy. And we identified that those individual needs were basically done through observations, through examining the documents they'd filled in, through that formal assessment process. So there are lots of different ways that we've used, like this slide shows. And I think that's really important because you need to kind of triangulate the information you get and use those various different sources to get an accurate picture of what the learning need really is. Also, I think the needs analysis process is really important in terms of getting buy-in from the participants. So, really useful way to promote and motivate them into doing the learning in the first place. Okay, so just moving on to the second competency area that BLP is looking for, and that's about understanding the principles of adult learning. So again, these principles, they're pretty straightforward and common sense, right? But I think it's important to think deliberately about how you communicate them, okay, or how you incorporate them, I should say. So many of them relate strongly to that behaviour model that I spoke about earlier. They're about the methodology or the practice of learning. Perhaps a more academic term for those who like vocabulary is the pedagogy, or actually it's the andragogy, which is now a term that I think is applied to adult learning as opposed to pedagogy, which is more about teaching children. So, and I think, suffice to say, these principles are really interrelated. So typically, an adult learner wants to learn something to solve a problem. And in doing so, they're looking for something that's quite practical rather than theoretical. It's got to be relevant to their specific problem or need. So as you can see, those words are quite interrelated. But I think the key point here is, how adults learn is very different to how children learn because they bring experience. So we've got to acknowledge and draw on that experience. And not only do they bring real life experience, but they bring learning experiences as well, which means that they often want to be involved in any decision making about the learning program too. They may have had some bad learning experiences and they don't want to do that sort of thing again. So if we're comparing adult learning with kids learning, I think the ways we learn as adults is perhaps more reflective. It's about considering how to apply concepts and perhaps thinking about the consequences, whereas when children learn, perhaps it's more about them understanding and then remembering some facts. So anybody want to share any comments or thoughts or any of their own experiences as an adult learner in here? Any comments from anyone, or are we all having internet difficulties? Okay, I'm going to carry on. Okay, I hope you're all still with me, and I'm really missing my buddy, I have to say. So the next area then is planning the learning. So in the BLP competencies, we're looking at, you've got a really sound plan in place, and that plan relates back to the needs analysis that you've done. So we want to see that you've got a training plan. So what's the purpose of a training or a coaching plan? So, with a training plan, it's very much about, tailoring the content to those needs. As I say, it's about thinking of how you're going to sequence and pace your topics appropriately. We want to see in your plan that you've got a way of doing that makes sense. We want to see that there's time management, resource management. You've got risks, mitigating risks, which I'm not sure that I've quite managed the risk of not having Jen with me today. But anyway, that should have gone in my plan. And it really helps to sort of frame, how successful your training is going to be through your evaluation process. And then similarly, what the purpose of a coaching plan is to ensure that, these are shared agreements. You've got your coachee on board, and you've got, some specific goals in there. You've got, a schedule that you're working to. You're establishing coaching methods, how you're going to work. You've got, you've set your expectations, and you're tracking those accountabilities and making sure that you've got some deliverables and milestones in there. And I'm sure we're all very familiar with SMART goals, goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based, because they're so useful for setting that coaching plan or a training plan even as well. And often, if it's a funded program, then donors will want to see SMART goals in there. Okay, so the last area is more around how you support and engage learners in your training. And, the principles of adult learning that we looked at before, they also really help us to think about how we support and engage people in their learning. So like we discussed, this is the how, how you deliver the training or the coaching. It needs to both build on the learner's skills and experiences and prior learning, but it needs to also keep them engaged or motivated. So just like a new building needs scaffolding to support it until it's able to stand fully on its own, so learners need support until they can take full control of their own learning. So that's when they start to realise that they have that shift from the what I don't know space to the I now know that I don't know space, so they can start to direct their own learning more. So as a coach or facilitator, a first supportive thing that you can think about is the learning environment. Is it suitable? So you might consider that in terms of whether it's too hot or too cold, or the room's too noisy or it's distracting. But then you also need to think about how you support the learner to get into the zone or get into a learning frame of mind. Often adults are juggling a variety of demands and their minds are elsewhere, or they may feel shy or uncomfortable in a group setting. So how can you as the coach or facilitator help them to be at ease and be ready to make the most of this learning opportunity? And I think Maslow's hierarchy of needs is quite helpful in thinking about these first two things. It helps with that motivation piece too, by identifying that the needs at the bottom of the pyramid must be satisfied before you can move up. So creating a learning environment is not just about the space you're in, but it's also about the culture that you create. A learning environment needs to feel safe. Ideally, it's a place where learners can explore ideas without judgment. In a group setting, it's often good to start with some fun icebreaker activities, for example, just to get those participants to feel relaxed and feel at ease. Or maybe in a coaching setting, checking in with your coachee on what's going on for them. So that's the first two things. And perhaps being a coach really applies to that third thing, but also in training as well. Questioning. It's not always about having the answer when you're a facilitator or coach, but certainly asking really helpful, useful questions that get people thinking, that kind of leads them themselves to solve their own problem often. And I find, so that's kind of encouraging reflection and participation. And I find, when you're a coach or a trainer, thinking about how you add to learning Or, you know, incidental learning is another way that I often like to think about. So this is ways that you might extend your learners' thinking and understanding, you know, just pushing the boundaries, if you like, of the topic that you're covering. So adding to might simply be about adding to an idea that's been discussed. Incidental learning, what I'm meaning by that is that, you know, it's that other stuff that you learn alongside the main topic. So a simple example could be learning new vocabulary. As a coach or a trainer, I don't think you need to dumb down the words you use to explain concepts, right? But you might need to explain any technical or difficult words that you do use. I find that people, they quite like to build their vocab. You know, they like to learn new words. So including and explaining those new words is perhaps better than avoiding difficult words, and a great way to extend people's learning. Okay, so in terms of scaffolding and learning and engaging learners, it's also good to incorporate different learning styles. You know, acknowledge that people have different preferences for how they learn. And so, you know, if you look at that visual, auditory, reading and writing and kinesthetic approach, you'll see that, you know, people have different ways that they like to learn. Now, usually we all like to learn with all of those different approaches. You know, so it's great as a coach to include all of those things. So something that's quite visual, something that's auditory, getting them doing things with their hands perhaps, and some reading and writing. But often you might find that a learner has a leaning towards one particular style. And then there's other kind of models that you can use, like the Honey and Mumford model, which kind of tells people that, you know, you might have a preference for a different sort of way of being. So you might be more of an activist, or more of a reflector, or you might be more of a pragmatist, or more of a theorist. So, you know, thinking about different learning preferences in line with these two models really helps us as a coach to try and incorporate all of those different styles that people might have. So then the next thing is as a coach or a trainer, you need to think about how best to explain a concept. Often you have to think about not just the topic itself and unpicking it, but you might have to think about the pace, the cadence, or the flow and sequence of the information that you're providing. So how you explain something, how you organize and group bits of information is really important. So if you can clarify and simplify as much as possible, then that makes it easier for people to understand. I often find that grouping things into 3s or 4s is quite helpful, because usually people can remember 3 or 4 concepts, and then going back and drilling down from there. You know, that's quite a useful thing to do. And storytelling, using case studies or other people's experiences, can also be a really powerful way to get messages across, as well as using analogies. That often really helps people to grasp concepts, particularly difficult concepts. And then, of course, another really great way to engage a learner is to do an activity together. You know, maybe work out a problem together. So, you know, you're doing it jointly. What a fabulous way to actually learn a new skill. I think that would probably be the top thing for me. So that's a little bit about
Barbara.
Hey, it's great to have you on board. I've struggled without you.
Oh, no. Apologies, everyone. You know what they say about internet in Australia. Well, it's all true.
No worries. Hey, Jen, we've rattled through things, and I haven't been able to draw on your insight and your knowledge into some of these things, but I hope that's been okay for everyone. But maybe I could get you to add some of your thoughts on this next slide, which is what a coaching plan should cover. I was wondering if you might be able to go over that with us. So this is really thinking about the BLP subsidy requirements, getting stuck into that now.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. And I know that you talked, I believe you did, because we about the importance of having a training plan and coaching plan earlier as something that's as one of the competencies in the competency assessment tool, and why it's important. So when it comes to applying for a subsidy for delivering a coaching and training service, we require the advisor, the coach or trainer, to include a coaching plan with the subsidy application. And the coaching plan, this isn't necessary, that there's not a set template or format for it, but because obviously coaches and trainers probably have their own style, the way that they learnt it, and that's great that you do. But it's important to have a look and just to make sure that before you submit it, that it covers the business issue, the problem, the need that coaching plan's going to address, the coaching objectives, the overarching objectives, and expressed in those SMART terms that I heard as I came in before Barbara cover. The coaching priorities, I call them priorities, but they might be other words. And this is basically the knowledge, skills, and attitudes, the KSNA. What are the knowledge or the skills or the attitudes that the coaching is going to change? And that really underpins the objective. So think about it as just the next level down. The approach, to let BLP know the approach that you're going to take. There's no right or wrong approach. We just want to understand what it is in terms of approving the subsidies. The goals, what will the impact actually be on the business goals there? And again, making sure that you can sort of measure them and time bound them and make sure that they're relevant and realistic. A suggested schedule and the milestones that you plan, and then how you're going to evaluate progress. Now, we're really aware that particularly with coaching, it can be more fluid than training, because you sort of needs emerge over time, but it's still quite critical to at least have had a conversation. And this is, typically when you're sitting down as a consultant with a client, you'll invest time in understanding their needs. So it's important to get some kind of framework, and Business Link Pacific is quite flexible in terms of giving a preliminary framework that you'll need to firm up after a couple of conversations. This has been the case when I've worked on other donor-funded programs, that when people are coaching, they might not be as structured in having a plan, but when it's a donor-funded program, it really is critical, because we need to basically demonstrate that if money is being given to support coaching, that there is quite a structured plan to it, and it can't be sort of too open-ended. So that's why we require this. But the team are pretty flexible, as long as you sort of have given consideration to this and given some sort of plan. And we know that meeting schedules can change, etc. And in addition to that, there's a requirement that coaching progress reports will be required at different times. Now, Smita has some really useful, just a 2-page guidelines on this that we can send to anyone who wants those.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Jen. Hey, now that I've got you back, if you don't mind, I'd really like to ask you to go back and explain a concept that I don't think I explained very well, and that's that was this slide here, the push-pull thing, because I think I really missed a lot of really valuable things that I know you can add. Could you just briefly go over that for us?
Absolutely. So what we might do, because it's a bit of it can be quite confusing. Are you able just to pull out the mentoring and advising? Oh yeah, just so we'll look at the training and coaching. I found when I first started getting into training and coaching and trying to understand the difference of it, was a really good organisation in Europe that was helping design the training programs. This model I found really, really useful in terms of the way to understand that training is about training and coaching is essentially about helping a business to solve some kind of problem, and depending on what level of direction we give them, it sort of suggests what sort of function we need to deliver. So this spectrum is quite helpful. At the very far end is this very directive pushing and providing a solution to a client, and that's kind of where training typically might fall. and going through that whole spectrum to where you're more and more pulling solutions and helping the client to solve the problem themselves, gets into more what is typically kind of a coaching technique. Now, the colleagues I worked with on this, they were very adamant coaching's way up the other end. There's no direction. It's purely about asking questions and reflecting, which I think some theorists say, but you know, I think in terms of people in the Pacific that I talk to, coaching is a bit more broad because there is often that sort of giving guidance. So this is this pull and at the level of direction I find quite useful. When we put, you know, advising and mentoring into the picture, it does, you know, because it does become a bit complicated. But I think advising tends to sort of sit around this, you know, you're offering guidance and giving advice, and then the clients can, and it's more kind of directed at the business than at an individual. And mentoring, there's an element of, and because, as you know, mentoring can sort of be a little bit more, often it's described as more about professional or career development rather than skills development. There is a bit of an element of giving direction and people's professional development, sort of guiding them and, you know, what they should, you know, who they could be contacting and what networks they could be building. So mentoring does have a lot of directing and asking questions and reflecting, but it's also giving that guidance. So I just find that this was a useful way to understand that, you know, you are wearing you could be wearing any of those hats at any point in time, but just knowing that when you're getting to that coaching area, that is the importance of listening and reflecting and summarizing back and helping the coachee solve their own problem. Does that help?
No, that's great. Thanks, Jen. Has anyone got any other questions? Now that we've got Jen back, I'm going to fire all the questions at you, Jen, if we've got any. So you're on mute, Jen. Sorry, were you saying something there, Jen?
Yeah, so I should unmute myself. And I see Ernest's notes, and yes, Ernest will send you that 2-page guidelines after the webinar. Fantastic.
Okay, no, that's great. Okay, so Jen, I know you've missed half of this webinar, but maybe I'll just ask you to sort of think about some key points for people to take away from what you know we've covered today. Yeah, for you, what are the key points around coaching and training?
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. I think, and my understanding, and I guess why people might have joined today, is really to understand that when it comes to the competency assessments, and obviously it's great for us to have a good network of coaches. We've got a great network of business advisors, but to have those who really do specialize in coaching and training, that was something that was suggested to Business Link Pacific and something that they've responded to. We've responded to by saying, yep, let's have a competency in this. Let's subsidise coaching and training that fit with the criteria. But to be eligible, the people, because a lot of people do bits of coaching and training, but to really get the competencies in this area, we really want to see that people understand and can demonstrate that they've done the learning needs analyses, that they've applied those learning needs analysis to plan a training or coaching session and the importance of that discipline. And then also to that they understand how adults learn differently. And I know Barbara talked about that. I had some really interesting discussions with Barbara about how that the adult learning differs from teaching children. And so that's real skills and techniques that need to, we want our business coaches and trainers to have full competency in. And then that whole idea of scaffolding the training and making sure that it's engaging, sufficiently engaging for that client's needs. So I think for those people who, if you're not, who are interested in developing that competency, they would be the 4 things to focus on, and there's lots of tools available for that. And I think that, we're here, and I know Barbara, in your role of supporting business advisors as well, happy to help out and give more tips and links to different tools to build those competencies.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and Jen, I think, when you boil all this down, what we've spoken about and all of those competencies, It's actually about empathy, isn't it? It's about putting yourself in the shoes of the learner. It's about understanding their perspectives, their needs, what motivates them, and then, how we can then support them. So if we've got that empathy, we've got that understanding, then we can give them better support. I think for me, that's what it's all about.
Indeed. And we have 2 questions here, Barbara. And comment. I'll go to Tim's comment first, which is really good point about engaging learners, because the language barrier is often something that our coaches and trainers face, and having an interpreter present, absolutely, and allowing the extra time for and preparation and planning for having the interpreter in as well. That's a really good point. Tim, for those with a second language. There's a question here about the competency process from George. Barbara, if I can get you to address this, what process will a coach follow up to getting the competency assessment and getting certified?
What process will a coach follow up on?
For getting a BLP competency assessment and certification. Okay,
so this is for the coach themselves. Is that what we're talking about? So in our competency assessment process, what happens is you provide some evidence of when you've done that thing. So we're looking for real life examples of when you've delivered training, and then the follow-up that you get from your assessor. So we've got a panel of assessors. You'll get some feedback from one of the assessors, which will say, okay, that sounds great. Yep, you've done that, and so we can see that you've applied those concepts, the four key competencies that we're talking about. Is that what we're meaning here? Sorry, George, I'm not quite sure if I'm on the right track there. So that's the sort of follow-up that you'd get from an assessor. So that helps you think about, have I applied those principles of adult learning? Did I really investigate and identify what their needs were? All of those things. So we're looking for real life examples, okay? Not what you theoretically or hypothetically would do, but what you've actually done. So that's how the BLP competency framework works. It's about what you've already done and demonstrated. I hope that sort of clarifies.
Thanks, George. Yes, and just follow up with other questions to us by email, George, if you need more on that. But he said yes there. And Barbara, if I can just add to, that is a really good point about empathy, and I think, it's we don't want to get caught up in, and I tend to do this because I want everything to be black and white, in definitions and how does coaching do. It's what is important is the communication skills and techniques, and empathy is something that I guess we can naturally have, but we can also learn techniques around engaging with our clients, whether it's in training or coaching or mentoring. So that element of there's some really good techniques that we can also that are worth looking into.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And because that communication piece is so important for business advisors and actually developing empathy, because they're really important, I think we're going to go further into some more depth with that topic in our next webinar, which is going to be in February. So that's going to be some techniques on communicating, so techniques for business advisors. Now that's cool. Any other questions or comments that anyone would like to make? Thanks for your engagement, guys. It's really good. Okay, well, that's all for now. Apologies for the internet connection. I'm sad to have lost you for a key part of that, Jen, because your insights and reflections would have been.
No, I'm sorry, team. I really am, everyone. I'll be on. I have to, when I get off here, I'll be straight on the phone to our internet provider. There's a really bad wind outside at the moment, and I have a feeling that's what's the cause of it. Something's being taken down.
No worries. We struggle through, and hopefully people got some useful things out of it. And thank you everyone for joining us in this webinar. Thanks again, Jen. It's been great sharing some experiences together, and thank you to our VLab participants that have joined us today. And we're also looking forward to catching up with you again next Tuesday to go over any specific further things that you'd like to discuss. But otherwise, our next public webinar or open webinar to business advisors will be in 2 months' time. So that's going to be Thursday, the 11th of February next year. It'll be at the same time, so that's 2 p.m. New Zealand time. Please make sure you check the time difference. though, because I know that you know, Pacific are on different time zones. And you know, as I said earlier, this series is about supporting business advisors to develop the skills they need to provide high quality services. So we do invite you to tell us what topics you'd like us to cover. There's my email on the screen. Please email me or pop a note in the chat right now if there are any other thoughts or ideas on topics you'd like us to cover. And of course, don't hesitate. Reach out to any of us here at VLP if you need any support or any advice. Thank you, Tomas. Whawhatailava, Vinaka, Mitaki Maata. I'm looking forward to seeing you all again next year. Merry Christmas, Merry Kirihimete, Mā te wā, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou, kia ora katoa.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.